welcome to this Financial Director web seminar sponsored by Infor. Today we're discussing how a well-executed cloud-based ERP strategy can positively transform your bottom line. I'm Chris Warmel, Senior Reporter with Financial Director, and I'm joined by Trevor Steele, who's the RVP of Infor Cloud Suite. Next to him is Gary Jesson, he's a Managing Director of eFinancial Management. And finally, but not least, is David Coffey. He's the VP of Value Engineering at Infor. So, welcome to you all. Without further ado, I'll just kick in, but just before we do plunge on in, actually, just like to mention a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. You, the audience, can ask and submit any questions you like. Bear in mind, it is before 9 p.m. So anything you like answered via the eponymous link on the site, do send it in. I will see those and I can put those to the panel. So do feel free to contribute and ask anything you feel you've got a burning desire to know. So without further ado, I'll plunge straight in. So for organisations, Trevor, experiencing rapid growth, aside from the benefits of greater income flow, obviously, what would you say are the primary challenges that senior finance executives typically face in business process management?
That's a good question. I find that the issues that they face are really letting go. Right? So when you talk about cloud and implementing systems in general, that's a major issue. As the organization grows, it's obviously going to expand. There are more people. It becomes harder to do things. And the way that a company has done things in the past to get them to the point of success that they're at now isn't necessarily going to translate to what they need to do in the future in order to grow that organization, because the paradigm changes the larger you get. The more resources you bring in, the slower things become, the more difficult it is to get things done, the more extended the lines of communication. So really, that's the challenge they face, is understanding what the change of paradigm is and how they're going to support it in the future to be successful as they move forward in their expansion.
Okay. Yeah, I'll also say, adding to that, typically any growth scenario, it's typically the people that's the biggest problem. It's getting people that are either stuck in their ways to change, or people seeing that there's a different way and perhaps a better way of doing things. And in my experience, most things sort of fail or go wrong because you can't get the people alongside. So really getting them on side and buying into a cloud-based movement is really important.
Yep.
I'll just add to that. I think if we look at business process management, we think of it as a transformation agenda, transformation project. Just like any major investment in any major transformation organization, you have to look at that first, then the technology follows thereafter, as opposed to often organizations that are not considering best practices might think of technology first, process or transformation second. And I think that paradigm, to Trevor's point, has to start with the transformation.
Mm-hmm. Are people doing that typically, would you say, or some are? I mean,
there's probably 4 quartiles or 4 quadrants, and there's an upper quadrant that is doing process and transformation that follows best practices. And then unfortunately there's another quadrant that's down on the bottom left that are still thinking of it as an iterative, operational, technological project that has costs as opposed to advantages.
Well, I think that's the difference of where organizations are successful and where they're not, though, when they move forward, is being open and understanding that it isn't about cost, it's about solving business solutions, or business issues with solutions. It's important to remember that's the whole premise of an IT solution, is to solve the issues of the business, not to provide a box in the corner of the room that you feed with data and just pull reports out of.
That's right, yes. Yeah.
Absolutely right. I think it also comes down to who leads these projects as well. Yes. Certainly different functions will have a different view. Sure. Yeah. It's really important to get a blend of a business team to run projects like this.
Yeah. And I mean, typically in an ideal scenario, what is that perfect blend, if you like? I mean, what might that typically be?
To me, it's very much going to be operational led. I think finance becomes a piece of that. As would an IT CIO person, but really the operational side, so someone who's in charge of ops as a whole should be the person that runs a project like this, in my view.
Okay, so I'm sort of moving on briefly. To what extent would you say an organisation's decision to implement financial software tools on its computers and network actually exacerbate or mitigate some of the challenges?
It can exacerbate it greatly if you do it incorrectly. If you're just looking at taking what you have and replicating that on a new software package or a new system, you're going to get to a result that is the same or worse than you have today, but faster. Right? So part of changing systems, whether that be through an upgrade or whether that be an acquisition of a new system, is to take that opportunity to look at business practices and, where appropriate, re-engineer those business practices to get you further ahead in your objectives. Working with a good vendor, whether that be a direct vendor or a client partner, can help you with leveraging best practices. They've obviously been through that exercise many, many times and are able to bring benchmarks to you that say, look, this is the easiest way to get from point A to B. You don't necessarily want to go through Z to get there, right? So they can certainly streamline that deployment, regardless of whether it's on-premise or in the cloud. Being in the cloud does speed that process up, particularly when you use things like implementation accelerators or best practices, because it'll give you a starting point rather than say, well, what do we do today? How do we want to do it in the future? So, well, this is the best practice right out of the box, as they say. So it'll speed that process up. You can still tweak those things and you can still make adjustments, but it's going to get you a lot further ahead, and it's going to solve a lot of the issues that you have right up front.
Okay, does that chime with the...
It does, and I think a lot of it is in the planning, really, and getting that right. And too often I see companies leaving decisions like this to quite late in the day, and then all the good intentions about cleansing data, getting old data off the system, sort of gets forgotten. Then you end up sucking along all the data that you should have really got rid of. It's a bit like moving house, isn't it? If you should try and get rid of the stuff out of the attic at the time, and it's a bit like that with data. But too often it goes wrong because people forget that, and suddenly they've got a bigger system than they thought. They've got a lot of legacy data that they don't want. So that becomes one of the challenges. I think the other big challenge I find around this is things like access controls probably change. People just need to think who needs what. So you can set things up slightly differently compared to having, say, a box in the corner where anyone can go and access it. You can be quite specific about these people have this and these people have that. So again, planning for that's really important.
Right, and in terms of perhaps getting through that sort of maze, how can, for example, our audience, CFOs or finance directors who are maybe thinking of going down this route, or some will obviously be further down that than others. What sort of, where should they sort of start, as it were? I mean, obviously, beginning's a fine place, but where might that be?
I think a lot of it is around perhaps talking to people that have been there. So it's either the implementers, the developers, the software providers, or more importantly, I find going to talk to reference sites. It's a great way, because they're the people that sort of tell you the things that the salespeople don't tell you. Not because they haven't told you, but the real practical side that I did this and something fell over here, because you just can't really see every scenario until you actually try it. So really getting a good a third party that you can reference and just tell me. I did something in our own business a while back where we just hadn't focused on the fact what we had to do with antivirus software as a result of moving onto the cloud. It's not we just forgotten really. We knew we had to have it, but we hadn't really thought about the implication of it being on a box compared to it now being on a cloud. And by talking to a third party, they'd gone through the same thing and alerted to that straight away. So.
Yeah, I mean, like they say, there's nothing new under the sun, right? So why reinvent the wheel every time?
Absolutely, yeah.
Chris, I'll just add to your question about the decision. And it's interesting, this audience being financial community. Where I often look at it from is the business case to make the decision, and considering a decision to implement a piece of software, financial software, cloud, starting from this is a business decision that should be put up against other business decisions and other investments and should bear the same kind of benefits or outcomes, better than the competing decisions that's before the chief financial officer or the financial community. And I think that's often at the very forefront of what should be in the decision making, and especially with respect to cloud. It's a new thing. Sometimes there's a certain amount of mystery to it, but really it is a fundamental investment decision that should be compared to other decisions in the organization.
Actually, that's a good point. I mean, we've all started to talk a lot more freely about the cloud now. Obviously, this is clearly all about the cloud. It might be worth actually just spelling out exactly what we mean by that, and without wishing to patronise our audience. But I mean, could you perhaps sort of say exactly what we mean by the cloud here in this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it is patronizing, because when I read articles on the web, there's a lot of different definitions of what cloud actually is, and some of them are counter to what the reality is. So the cloud is a software as a service offering. It's also known as that, or SaaS is the acronym. It is where you can avoid buying a perpetual license, avoid buying hardware and bringing in IT resources to administer that. So it's really designed to be software as a service, as a turnkey solution. So everything you need in order to be able to run that solution is provided for you via an internet connection to a data center somewhere. That differs from hosting, which some people consider to be semi-cloud, in the fact that in a hosted model, you are accessing a data center somewhere else, but you own the software. It's an asset in effect. So cloud is different in that respect, and that kind of leads to, you know, where David looks at is how does that affect the total cost of ownership? Because once you're accessing it as a service and you don't have to make that large upfront capital investment, the total cost of ownership over a period of time in aggregate should be significantly lower. But again, that conversation isn't always around the cost of ownership. Cloud brings several benefits when people look at things like agility, being able to leverage and access that ubiquitously regardless of what that device would be. So you can access a service as opposed to a perpetual software installed on a server at your location via a number of different devices, whether that be a desktop, a laptop, an iPad, a smartphone. All of those are able to access through that internet connection.
Okay, I mean, David, obviously you've sort of gathering already that your kind of expertise is this kind of cost versus
the business decision.
Yeah.
Yes,
so
exactly.
I mean,
yeah. I'll just.
Did you want to expand on that at all?
I think Trevor raised a really good point, and it's wonderful. This audience, when you say something like total cost of ownership, the audience before us gets excited about that. Often we work with people in organizations that TCO, total cost of ownership, could be something that they view as a threat. If they have an infrastructure, technology infrastructure that they've sustained and maintained for a long time, that's their heritage, that's their legacy, and that's their cost structure that they're used to. Total cost of ownership for the cloud is usually a lower over time sequence of cash flows. And while I'm only hesitating because it is not the lead decision factor for going to cloud. It should not be. There's all kinds of other financial, strategic, operational benefits and best practices companies are going to that for a whole bunch of good reasons. But total cost of ownership, or TCO, must be part of the consideration. And as I say, generally, TCO is a lower cost factor than an on-premise situation.
And that kind of depends on the way that a company, when they look at the traditional model of purchasing software, wants to plan that out. So that's one of the benefits of cloud, is scalability, and the fact that it becomes much more predictable regardless of whether the cost is higher or lower. It's predictable. So when I think about organizations that are looking to grow and be more successful, they're going to expand out their application. And the question they have to ask when they first start in on that software is, okay, so I'm going to size a server to a particular level to handle a particularly user count and number of transactions.
Yep.
If I grow over the course of 3 years, is that hardware going to be large enough to accommodate the growth that I anticipate?
Yep.
So I'm making a decision at that time. Do I want to spend more money than I really need to today in order to secure against the future, or do I want to risk it that my growth isn't going to be as high and run the risk that I'm going to have to change out the hardware in entirety?
Exactly. Yeah.
Cloud gives you the benefit from that particular standpoint to say, okay, well, I'm just going to pay for what I use in effect, and as I grow, the environment should grow with me, and there shouldn't be any incremental cost other than maybe users or employees that access that system. So it's much more predictable. It's also affected by cloud definitions of things like single and multi-tenant. So those terms are kind of bandied around the marketplace, and there is a difference. Those are both viable cloud deployment methods. The difference between the two of them is a single tenant, also known as a virtual private cloud, is a standalone environment where a client has sole access to that environment. They don't share it with anybody else. A multi-tenant environment is where many organizations may be in that cloud. It's also known as a public cloud, and they share the cost of that. So the cost is typically lower for multi-tenant. The data is segregated out, so there's never any risk of crossover with the data, but you do share the same code base for the software. So there's less flexibility in being able to take things like patches and upgrades or being able to configure or customize that software to your own needs. So there are pros and cons for both of those models. They're both viable and readily accepted cloud methods. And that's where some of the confusion around what does cloud mean comes from the web when people read these things, because some people say, well, single tenant really isn't cloud, it's hosted, and that's not true.
Okay.
I think the important thing as well, it's picking up David's point, it's a different way of looking at costing. I think most finance people are probably quite used to traditionally costing out what a cost of an IT system like that is. This, you have to think about new things. You have to think about new services. You have to think about some of the systems cap your storage and you pay extra for incremental storage. So you have to factor that into your decision. Not every piece of software is necessarily included in the initial quote. You have to understand, do you need Microsoft licenses? Do you need antivirus? So, things you probably already have, but you might need to buy them differently. Yep. So actually doing the cost comparisons, it's really important to speak to somebody who's been there. Yep. Otherwise, almost certainly every person I've spoken to has tended to forget something in their calculation.
And you're right, because it does vary by vendor to some degree, so you need to make sure that you read the fine print.
Absolutely.
When we at Infor talk about cloud, we talk about fee simple and transparent costing. So everything you need to access that service or run that environment is included in that service. So it's completely transparent, and there's never a situation where you receive an invoice at the end of the year that says, congratulations, you used this much storage. Right. Because in our opinion, that kind of goes counter to accessing a service. And then those supplementary invoices that some people provide are more in line with what I would classify as that hosting kind of off-site arrangement. Yeah.
We're actually, sorry to interrupt, we're actually getting quite a few questions. Would you, typically we kind of leave questions to the end. Are you happy for me to kind of pepper them through this? We've got one here saying how easy is it to move from one service SaaS to another? I guess one SaaS service to another. Does that make sense?
Well, certainly my experience, if you're moving the software, the same software, it's sort of relatively easy. If you're moving from one product to a new product, that's where I think some of these, particularly cloud-based specific products, it's actually really difficult to migrate because they don't always leave you a natural data path to take the data out. So certainly at the entry level of some of these products, in days gone by on good old-fashioned legacy systems, you could probably put a CSV file out and import it into a new system. Some of these are now bespokely written in such a way that once you move, your data probably is lost. It's not always the case, but you've really got to look at that decision if you're looking to upgrade.
And I would certainly say, I would colour that answer a little differently, Gary, in the fact that certainly from my experience, the change from an on-premise to a cloud or an on-premise to an on-premise different solution is a re-implementation at that point, right? The way that it differs in the cloud is depending on the solution is how configurable is that solution. And we go kind of back to that single multi-tenant discussion on, what are we going to allow you to do within that environment? And to your point, if you've got customizations in one particular solution that they've allowed you to do it in a single tenant and you want to move that to a multi-tenant solution, they say no customizations, that's a very difficult path. Most people will give you at the end of the contract, because that's the other thing about it, is you basically license the software or the subscription for a term contract. It could be 3 years, 5 years typically, because there's a cost involved in getting there in the first place. So it doesn't make sense in a lot of cases to do it for a year or two because of the overhead associated with that. But they'll give you a file at the end of that you're free to do with. The question then becomes, well, how do we map that data to
a new system?
Yeah, and typically it's an FTP file that you go pull from a server somewhere and you're able to do that. So it really depends on which solution you're coming from and which you're going to, but there are usually migration paths, and there aren't, certainly when you look at ERP software and financial management packages, there's a few in the market, but there aren't thousands. People have been from one to the other at some point in the past and working with either the chosen vendor, the vendor you're moving to, they should have some kind of methodology to be able to bring that data in from an FTP file or a CSV file.
I think it's really important in a fast growth environment. If you're likely to outgrow the system, fairly quickly, you need to think about that. Whereas
Right.
once you're on a large ERP system, generally you don't change them on a regular basis. You're upgrading to new features and new versions.
And I would say that's a really good point in the fact that regardless of whether you're doing it in the cloud or you're doing it on-premise, when you select a financial management package or an ERP system, you're making a long-term commitment. So the contract may be 3 years, but when we look at the upgrade path for on-premise customers, they're typically upgrading anywhere between 4 and 8 years, right? The same really applies to a cloud instance, and typically you're kept on the current version of the software. So the upgrade is going to be much more frequent. It's going to be in that 4-year mark as opposed to the 8-year mark. Or I've actually worked with some clients and they said, well, when was the last time you upgraded? It's just last year. And it's like 1998.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, and you're really surprised that it doesn't do what you need it to do, right? So, you leave a lot of value on the table when you don't keep the current version. So that's one of the benefits of cloud, is they keep you up to date. But you really are making a long-term commitment, and it should be viewed that way, regardless of whether you're on-premise or in the cloud.
I agree. I think the other thing that comes with that as well is that when you traditionally buy sort of out-of-the-box type software, you just make that decision. I think when you're buying a SaaS software product or service, you actually need to look at the vendor as well and look at their viability. Because you're taking your point there, Trevor. You're buying into it for 3-5 years. You want them to be around in 3 or 5 years' time.
Yep.
And that viability decision is actually a really important part of that decision making.
Yep.
And what's going to happen if they're not around? How do I get my data? How do I continue with that service?
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. You need to look at making sure that the customer or the client in this case has long-term viability. They're financially stable. They're large enough to weather changes in technology, and more importantly, they're able to invest in their product. Because if you don't invest in a product, there's going to be attrition to that, and the more people that move away from that service, the greater the risk that the company will go out of business. Because in the on-premise world, when a company goes out of business, you continue to use the software, you just don't get any updates. In the cloud world, when the company goes out of business, if nobody picks it up, you lose the service.
Yep.
I'll just build a point on investment. I think visiting a lot of companies with an on-premise ERP or software, the investment in the solution sometimes comes from the company, their own personal customizations. And many companies we have seen, the cost of customization and the add-ons over time, back to your point, some of these companies that invested in software in 1998 or 2000, so 15, 16 years later, they've actually changed the composition of that software so dramatically and made the investment. So back to just a key feature of cloud business advantages is that ongoing R&D comes from the vendor. Right. And it's not just a nice thing, it's a requirement of the vendor to continue that investment on behalf of all those customers.
Correct.
And as I say, comparing it to an on-premise situation where you might find yourself doing your own customizations over time.
Yeah.
It's a key feature that I think, a key feature and a key benefit to considering cloud.
Yeah, and that creates in the on-premise world what they call version locking. So
exactly.
A client might want to upgrade, but they can't
That's right.
because of the customizations
right.
and the fact that they'll have to rewrite a lot of
That's
them.
right.
Cloud avoids that version locking situation, to your point, firstly by making sure that you're taking enhancements and upgrades as appropriate, but also working, regardless of whether it's vendor investment or whether it's co-development, to build functionality into the core product so that you can leverage it, and in the case of a single tenant solely, but in the case of multi-tenant, we would do that development, and then all people benefit, basically. So, companies, when they're evaluating a vendor, often talk about, well, how do you determine where enhancements come from? The best place to garner those enhancement requests is from the user base, because they know what the shortfalls are. It's all very well to be a developer and develop what you think clients want. It's much better to have the client tell you what he wants.
Exactly. Yeah.
The interesting thing that goes with that, though, sometimes is you can't necessarily upgrade as quick as you might choose to if you're in control of your own destiny, because a lot of cloud vendors will test things thoroughly, and they'll only deploy upgrades once they're ready.
Correct.
And you might be waiting for that next upgrade, but you can't do it because your vendor's not ready.
Yep.
So again, it's one of those considerations you need to think through.
Should we just take one more question, then we'll move back to it's in like 2 parts. It says, cost-effective solution depends on the intrinsic benefits. There is a lot of focus from software providers on dashboards, but not on the ease and cost of inputting the data. The key aspects of cloud are security. Some providers, sorry, this is where I have to go into the second half. Some providers keep providing upgrades, which are costly to support, and connectively changes costing expenditure. What are your views?
Well, my view on that is it's a two-part question. So if we start with the reverse part about the upgrades and costly to support, certainly in the cloud, those upgrades are, the cost of supporting those is significantly reduced because there's no technical expense assumed with taking that upgrade. So in the past, in the on-premise world, a patch or an upgrade is released. You would go back to a services organization, whether it be the vendor or whether it be a third-party services organization. You would have to have hardware in order to configure and load that software. Then you would look at maybe reconfiguring it. And there's a great deal of expense. So you're really looking almost at a mini re-implementation at that point. With cloud, because updates and upgrades are more incremental and less large slugs of changes coming through, the changes are more readily absorbed. In some cases, you can receive an upgrade on a push basis and turn on or off pieces of functionality that you may or may not require, but it doesn't or shouldn't require any input from you to change significantly business processes without your requirement.
Just on that aspect of inputting, the same question is actually asked a sort of ancillary question, which is, are there ways of getting hands-on experience as an inputter in a variety of software systems? Does that?
Yeah, there are. I mean, certainly things like sandboxes are available where you can go in and look at it. There are pros and cons to the sandbox methodology. The pro is obviously you get to see the software, you get to understand the look and feel of it. The con is that frequently with financial management packages or ERP packages, they're relatively complicated, and therefore without user training, you can not understand how to use it, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, this software doesn't work, it doesn't do what I need it to do, but it's because you don't have the experience in understanding that. Kind of going back to the inputting of the data and the user experience, though, I think it's important to consider that most of the software packages these days, the user interface can be configured by user role or to the individual requirements, so it can be structured that way without programming or customization. So the ability to adjust those interfaces has been opened up and doesn't require necessarily IT input to be able to do that. Dashboards are a great thing, but they're not appropriate for everybody in every situation. You don't necessarily need dashboards in a data transaction screen where you're entering, invoice information or a purchase order. But it is nice to be able to have things like a 360-degree view of the data, so to be able to see all of the requisitions on the screen that fed the purchase order, and if you're in a purchase order and there's been activity against it, what materials were received, what invoices have been received and vouched against it, and were checks cut. So those kinds of functionalities have significantly enhanced the user experience, as opposed to the old paradigm of what we call the green screen or the character-based screen, where it's a black screen with green text on it, and it basically tells you nothing. And people learn how to go tab, 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 input a cell data, tab, tab, tab. That's non-value added activity. So the intent would be streamline down the screens, only see the fields that you actually require to put data in or informational to you, and take everything else off. You can shorten the keystrokes by 50 to 60%, make the data go in a lot faster.
I think the reality as well, the cloud is sort of almost irrelevant to that input decision.
Correct.
Whether you buy an in-premise on-box server or a cloud, it's the same issue. Can I have a go? Have you got a demo system or something I can try on? If that's the challenge, then ask for it.
Yep.
We work with a number of SMEs where we do have live systems that are demo systems, where we say to people, go and bash away, put data on and get comfortable with it. And most people will make that available if there's a sale at the end of the line. So I don't think that's a cloud-specific question. I think that's a general question you should consider for any software change.
Yeah, and I would make another point about the data entry, is I would say that enhancements in functionality is one of the benefits of staying up to date of things like workflow management. Right? You want to get away from putting in data if you can. Why double enter? Have workflows constructed that will seed the data for you wherever appropriate. Push it through the process, because you will recognize cycle times shortened down and productivity improvements.
Okay. I think just sort of approaching fear. I mean, fear is something which made Stephen King a lot of money. I guess a lot of businesses out there also have a certain amount of fear about, the cloud, it's kind of, how am I going to do this, How can they kind of overcome this? I mean, what are the sort of simple steps, if there are? I imagine there are such steps where you can overcome this fear to kind of
Yeah, I guess my
board, really?
my view as an FD is really, are you in any worse position than you are now? In my experience, most companies that are in an in-premises sort of server-based system probably at more risk than they are on the cloud. They've probably got the server in some corner of an office, accessible 24/7 by anyone who breaks in, staff, whatever. Whereas you go to a cloud system, the security and access controls are phenomenal compared to what a company can do. Things like all the online hacking and all that, well, that's going to happen whether you've got a server or not. But in reality, most SaaS providers have got levels of security that I couldn't dream of spending or implementing as an FD in a business.
Yep.
So actually, I think the fear is almost like it's a bit of a myth, really. I think in reality, if you analyse it properly, yes, there's some risks, but there's risks in the real world as well. And generally, you end up with a better solution, I think, on the cloud. I was just saying that to an MD earlier on. That's exactly that. I said, what's your fear? When you actually analyse and rationalise that, he said, yeah, you're right. There isn't a fear at all.
In fact, I'll just build on Gary's point. Maybe we should dismiss the word fear and go to risk mitigation. I think that's probably, especially a community of financial managers and financial analysts and CFOs, they're in the business of risk mitigation on a daily basis. So the best way to address risk mitigation in a cloud decision is to do some kind of pre-assessment or assessment of your current environment and where your future ERP or financial software expectations are, and walk down a list of sort of questions about the maturity of your organization, its IT infrastructure, its security situation, and a number of other things, business process efficiency. That kind of assessment, maturity assessment, will hopefully deal with risk mitigation and avoid any reference to the concerns about fear of the cloud, which I think is where we should be.
Okay, I mean, assuming they've done all those steps and they've done their research and preparation and their risk mitigation, etc. Is it deemed best practice for an organisation to move their financial information to the cloud as well?
Yeah, I mean, these systems are designed to be fully integrated systems, so you would never have a situation where the software or the code processing sits in one location and the data sits in another. It's kind of counterintuitive to do that, to enter data in on a screen, have it pass somewhere else, processed, and then the results pass back to another server or database somewhere. That's completely counterintuitive. So typically the entire environment, including the data, will sit in a single location, and people will access it and process it that way. To the point made by Gary and David, the risk is minimal. You actually face more risk from internal resources than you do externally. And what I mean by that is somebody's changing role, or they're disgruntled, they print reports out, or they dump a file and they take that data with them to the next employer. That's the biggest risk. So cloud isn't an issue there, and in fact, to Gary's point, I really view that as taking your tree fort and turning that into a castle, because cloud providers live or die on their ability to secure your information, right? So they have more incentive in some degree than you do to secure that, and they apply many, many layers of security, both physical, as regards to 24/7 guards. Certainly, where we deal with people like Amazon Web Services, they have 24/7 guards there. They have closed-circuit televisions. They have biometric entry. They have man-trap into the building so that only one person can go through at a time, and one door's open and the other's closed. They don't allow people in. I mean, when you drive through a Premier data center or past it, you don't even know it's a data center, because the first level of security is obscurity. Why label it, right? So, Gary had mentioned several times earlier, with the risk of if somebody breaks into your establishment, they basically have access to your data. Well, that's never going to happen in the cloud. Everything that transfers to that data center and back to you is encrypted. So even if they steal the data, there's no way of reading it. It takes years to break AES 256-bit encryption. So it's highly secured. You can become an extension of that network. So any firewalls you have within your own network are then leveraged to add an additional level of security. So extremely robust.
I think the question to ask, Chris, is in this world of data sensitivity is you should ask the provider, where is the data being stored?
Yeah.
Because obviously we've got some fairly strict data protection laws in the UK. Those laws aren't necessarily replicated. So you need to understand where that data sits somewhere in the world. And if it's offshore, that's really important to understand.
Sorry to interrupt. There's yet another question. It's someone's asking about moving ERP onto the cloud. How best to approach the replication of legacy ERP integration? with other business systems? What's your...
It depends on the methods they're using today for integration. So the generally recognized standard is XML to pass business object documents backwards and forwards. Some of those would need to be rewritten. Some of them may function and you would be able to map. Certainly if you're doing an upgrade from an on-premise situation to a cloud situation, you may be able to reuse most of those. You just need to repoint the IP address to the cloud environment. Typically the vendor would go through as the start of the process, maybe part of the cloud maturity model that we support as the assessment to say, okay, well, what integrations do you have? What third-party systems are you working with? Because again, this isn't an isolated world, and we all understand that there are going to be various different packages that you use for various different functions. So most major vendors have either APIs or business object documents written to be able to interface with other vendors, and it's fairly easy to map those out. There are mechanisms to rewrite where appropriate, and a whole host of integration methodologies supported by most vendors.
We probably have about 10 minutes left. I guess like Forrest Gump, this could run and run. I mean, we're getting loads of questions.
Good.
Is there anything, are there any particular topics that you'd like to sort of cover? We could perhaps leave sort of 3 or 4 minutes for a couple of questions at the end. Is there anything particularly you guys wanted to, you feel we haven't kind of covered off in this relatively short time frame?
I've got one thing that I think people overlook is the connectivity point. A lot of people necessarily their connectivity isn't as robust as perhaps it should be, and one of the important things is you're now living 24/7 through an internet connection.
Yep.
So one of the things you need to really think through and plan through is how robust is that connectivity? How big is is the pipe or the connectivity to your business? Because lots more people will now be using that data. Also, if you're passing big files, that's less so in a finance environment. But if you're working with creatives or big documents, so because more and more people are using the cloud system, you've got to make sure it's robust. The other thing slightly I've come across a few times also in this world of ever reducing resources, you've got to make sure that the data center's got backup power and things like that as well, because that's a big issue for data centers now. And if power switches off and they can't keep uptime, you've got a real problem as a business.
Yeah, and not just power. I mean, we certainly leverage an infrastructure, to your point a little earlier about where does the data reside. So we have 11 regions throughout the world, and Amazon Web Services is adding another 5 this year. So there'll be up to about 40 data centers across the globe in regions that are required. So for example, there'll be 3 in Europe, right, because we have safe harbor requirements here. There will be 4 by the end of 2016 regions in North America, and then in the Far East as well. So all of those data centers act actually in the way that they've structured them to be redundant for each other. So we never store the test environment and the production environment in the same data center. We never store the backups in the same data center as the production environment, because what happens if the power goes out? You need to restore. The cooling, so people talk about the power. The cooling is essential.
Yeah, great.
These machines generate an awful lot of heat. And if the cooling goes out, it'll shut the data center down. So everything within that infrastructure, from the servers to the cooling to the network, is completely redundant.
I think probably another question here for David. I think it was good to start with. One argument often trotted out for implementing cloud-based software is that an organisation can represent the cost of software as an operating expense rather than a capital expense. Is that justified?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's an important consideration for a financial director or CFO is where that expense sits on financial statements. And it is put on the operating line as opposed to a capital expenditure, which I think gives more flexibility to the financial decision making that person has.
You're buying a service rather than an asset, and therefore you can't depreciate it down over 3 or 5 years.
Okay, yeah, good point. Okay.
You have to think that through in terms of what else is going on in the business. If you've got bank covenants that are triggered on earnings, suddenly your earnings have come down as a result of that change. So there's wider implications you need to think through as part of that decision making.
Okay. Are there any specific factors that financial directors should consider in terms of mitigating any problematic issues on data migration, redundancy and security issues? Now you've sort of touched on that, but is there anything else you wanted to draw out, or should we move on to?
Just to understand, when you talk about data migration, to Gary's point a little earlier, is what data do you want to migrate? How clean is that data? in a lot of instances, certainly with older systems, you find out that if there hasn't been good controls in record keeping, that you may have the same customer in that data set rendered 3 or 4 times because they spelled the name a little differently, they put it in caps in one system and not in the other. So you might need to go through a deduplicating exercise to clean that. And then the second consideration is, how much data do you actually want to migrate over? If you've got a system that's been on premise for 20 years, you don't need to bring 20 years worth of data with you, right? You might need to bring, 3, 4 years, something like that, maybe a little more if you have a regulatory requirement, it could be 7. But in the majority of cases, you're going to want to archive that data, or if you need to report against it, put it into a data warehouse that then frees up the financial management package or the ERP package from having to store and process that information. Because if nothing else, when you run reports and inquiries against it, the system will have to process that much more data in order to return a result.
Okay. And are there any examples of best practice you can share for how an organisation, particularly one expanding into new markets or overseas territories, can implement to ensure a smooth transition from on-premise cloud to cloud-based finance software?
I think in my experience, we work with a lot of overseas companies, and it does allow ease of picking up a new sort of start-up a new territory really easy. The software's there. Yes, you need a bit of localization for things like VAT rules and local legislation, but you can switch on the product fairly quickly. The chart of accounts, all that's pretty much standardized already. And the nice thing about it is you can just switch on the bits that are relevant to that particular country. You don't have to switch on the whole system. So actually it allows that expansion, I think, to become a lot quicker.
Yeah, and I think in the case of where you've got multinational packages or packages that are able to support multinational operations, you don't need to set anything else up to be able to access it. You just set the users up. Most of them will support, you'll have a single chart of accounts at that point. It eases consolidation, or you can go into a consolidation package such as Dynamic Enterprise Management or Hyperion or something like that. So you get access to all of that very, very quickly without having to set up a data center or hardware and infrastructure at a particular location, because that's what really introduces risk and lowers the barrier to entry, is what do I have to invest in that office or in that location to establish an IT system? You're basically duplicating everything you have up at the corporate office or the other offices, facilities you have, and that's non-value added activity.
I'll just build on an actual example with a customer had a very similar situation, a very large central organization, series of subsidiaries around the world, we were speaking about an ERP or financial system from 1998. Theirs was from 1998. So the subsidiaries had small hardware installations everywhere. And our conversation with them was, and it was quite enlightening to them to realize that this doesn't require a hardware installation in your small subsidiaries anywhere. It is just almost not quite, it starts up immediately, but the reduction in subsidiary unit costs was significant, and implementation speed was significantly lower. And they were quite delighted to hear that.
Yeah, it almost allows even smaller organizations to put into place a shared services model.
Exactly, yeah.
Which has been, the beauty of large organizations with lots of resources that they can run those shared services models. It really brings that down the scale to companies that may have not been able to afford to leverage that in the past.
Okay. Chris, we didn't, just on the issue of implementation as we come near to a close, one of the things that we noticed very, very immediately is cloud implementation versus on-premise implementation. Actually doing that heavy lifting project that so many organizations know. They go through what they often refer as the valley of despair as they spend years implementing. I think anybody that implements software will recognize that. The shortened implementation time, the factors of 10 to 1 are used. It's just incredible in terms of the speed of implementation and the time to value. Often implementation is how fast can we get to the deployment of an asset that gives us a return on investment. That's what implementation should be looked at. Cloud offers a shortened time to value. It means that you're using that software to get the results faster than had you used it on premise. And that can be monetized. That can be identified in terms of actual time, which has an actual dollar value or pound value on it. It's important to realize.
Yeah, typically when you look at using best practices or implementation accelerators that will bring that implementation down from years to literally months.
Yeah.
Time, gentlemen, is one thing. We have pretty much run out of. Apologies to, we had quite a lot of questions here. Apologies for not getting around to answer them all. I'm sure perhaps I can forward them on to the guys and you'd be happy to probably answer them offline, I'm sure, yeah. But thank you very much for being a very engaged audience. Hopefully that's down to our terribly engaging panel. And all that's down to say thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.